Japanese characters that you have just seen on the screen mean the end. For us, as victorious Americans, that meaning is quite clear. The end of the Japanese war machine. The end of a war that resulted in overwhelming victory for the United States and disastrous defeat for Japan. This question has arisen. Does the Japanese nation, not yet completely emerged from the darkness of rigid censorship, understand the extent of its defeat? The picture that you are about to see, photographed in Tokyo a short time ago, is presented as convincing evidence that those who guided Japan's Navy throughout the war, that is, the former high-ranking officers and important civil officials, not only understand the extent of their country's defeat, but that they know exactly how and why that defeat came about. Let these former officers and officials explain the causes of their defeat themselves.
The Daiichi Building in Tokyo, headquarters of the Supreme Commander Allied Powers, December 1945.
From long residence in the United States, I knew the great industrial capacities of your country. Also, I studied your method of working in the last war. I knew that Japan could not possibly make successful war against the United States. Most of the senior naval officers felt the same way, and hence they wished me success in my mission as ambassador to the United States. Prior to the outbreak of war, Japan did make an attempt to estimate American industrial power, but the estimation was superficial. It would have been impossible for anyone to have visualized the production power of America. Once in the war, it was necessary to do the best we could, even though the Japanese war potential was only good for about 2 years. The tide was beginning to turn at midway at the time of my departure from New York. Wise statesmanship might at least have suggested an effort for peace in the early days, perhaps after Saipan. But it was the fate of my people not to be psychologically ready for such early peace moves, especially in the services. Hence, the disaster which has overtaken us.
The Japanese war plans were a long time in the making, and well-laid plans are usually vulnerable only to extreme surprise. Vital to the success of those war plans was the garrisoning of many strategic islands in the Pacific, with strong army forces to guard what the Japanese considered all-important airfields.
Japan went to war primarily to obtain essential oil and raw materials from the southern Dead area. Her military strength was disposed so as to occupy that area and protect lines of communication between it and the empire. It was the responsibility of the Army to defend the west and south side of the perimeter, and the Navy to the east. That is the Pacific. As we all know now, the Army garrisons were generally bypassed, and the war consequently was primarily fought by the Japanese Navy from Midway and the Solomons to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The sum and substance of the loss of the war was that Japan simply did not have the war potential to stand up against the power of the United States as brought to bear by the United States Navy task forces and the amphibious forces which followed them. The speed with which you train powerful amphibious forces was a complete surprise to us. Even though all our forces rested to the utmost, your amphibious operations never failed once, in spite of being handicapped by severe weather conditions as you were at Iwo Jima.
No war may be fought without an abundant supply of steel. Steel for guns, ammunition, ships, railroads, precision instruments. Steel is food for the war machine.
Steel is the basic material in war as well as in peace. Japan gets its major supply of iron ore from China and Strait settlements, since there is no high-grade ore available in the main islands. Good coking coal is also not available here and must be shipped in from China. With the wartime requirements of more than 5 million tons per year, it is apparent that the steel industry became directly dependent on the availability of merchant shipping. Thus, the state of health of steel production could be said to be directly dependent on the operation of United States submarine. The net result was a gradual strangulation of our steel production with a consequent deterioration in the whole war effort, not only munitions, but railroads, shipbuilding, and in every other field.
If steel is the war machine's food, oil is its drink. A nation at war is no stronger than her lifeline of oil.
Japan's chief supply of oil came from America in the years prior to the war. Therefore, since the war started, our wartime requirements, which amounted to about 5 million tons a year, had to be supplied mostly from the Dutch East Indies. One of the decisive factors in our defeat was the activities of American submarines which cut off the supply from that source entirely. As a consequence, our petroleum supplies were so reduced that at critical times our planes could not take the air because of lack of gasoline.
It is common knowledge that Japan's mighty Navy and naval air arm were superior to ours in strength and numbers after Pearl Harbor. At the Battle of Midway, June 1942, much of this superiority still existed. Upon her Imperial Navy and naval air arm depended the difference between early victory or eventual defeat. And aware of this, Japan fought accordingly, throwing every resource in her power into the fight.
The Japanese Navy suffered its first serious losses at the Battle of Midway in 1942, and later in the continuing struggle in the Solomons. In June of the next year, 1944, occurred the Battle of Philippine Sea, and here again we took extremely heavy losses, particularly in our carrier strength. Finally, what remained of the Navy was practically destroyed in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which occurred in October of 1944. Our records show that about 36% of the major vessels, that is vessels larger than destroyers, were lost to the United States submarines, that about 11% were lost to the naval gunfire and torpedoes, and finally 48% to carrier air attack. This represents 95% of our total losses, which were attributed to action of the United States Navy.
In the early days of the war, Japan was even more conscious, if possible, of the importance of naval air power than the United States. Elimination of that air power was imperative if the skies over San Francisco were to be kept clear of an enemy that was as capable and strong as it was fresh and eager.
Japanese naval air was a decisive element in early operations. It spearheaded the advance to the south, southeast, and east. It crippled the United States air power in Hawaii and destroyed it in the Philippines. It sunk the Repulse and the Prince of Wales. Correspondingly, the loss of that naval air power was a major cause of our defeat. It should be noted that the Japanese Army Air Force was not located so as to be useful in the deciding stages in the type of war that developed, at least in the early period. They being largely in China and Manchuria. Also, not sufficient attention had been paid in training to overseas operations.
What happened to Japanese naval aviation during the war?
We lost one naval air force at Midway to the United States Carrier Task Force strikes. We lost another and many replacements in the long battle for the Solomons, which started with Guadalcanal. Then, in the first Philippines Sea battle, and in the task force strikes on Formosa and the Philippines, we suffered heavy losses. The absolute remnant of our force were finally lost in the battle for Leyte Gulf.
No war has ever yet been won by employing defensive strategy. As long as the enemy is on the offensive, he is on the move, closer and closer to your own second and third lines of defense, his very momentum turning the advantage to him, psychologically as well as materially. It is at this point that the bold stand must be made. the battle site and exact moment chosen, the chances for victory against odds weighed, discarded, reweighed. For this is the time when an hour more precious to American liberty than any other in history can be gained.
ミッドウェー海戦です。ミッドウェーまでは日本は攻勢でありました。開戦後、日本の戦略は防御的ならざるを得なくなりました。
The captain says that Midway was the turning point of the war, for up to that time Japan had been on the offensive. But after the Battle of Midway, it was forced to adopt a defensive strategy.
Captain, would you give us your opinion as to the relative merits of horizontal and dive bombing in the Battle of Midway?
ミッドウェー海戦において、水平爆撃と急降下爆撃に対するあなたのご意見はどうでしょうか。
帰国の艦上急降下爆撃機は我が軍を反転後退してしめました。急降下爆撃機の攻撃で日本は4隻の航空母艦を失いました。水上艦艇に対するミッドウェー海戦での帰国の水上爆撃機の効果は一段も命中しなかったと思います。速い速力の艦艇は巧みな運動で高高度よりする水平爆撃機の攻撃を避けられますが、帰国の航空母艦から来る艦上急降下爆撃機はこれを避けるのはほとんど不可能であります。
The captain says that it was carrier-based dive bombers which turned back the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese lost 4 carriers to carrier-based dive bomber attack. He does not believe that high-level bombing had much effect because he doesn't recall one direct hit being scored by our high-level bombers during the battle.
Merchant shipping is the bloodstream of the war machine. Even if ample supplies of steel and oil are on hand, when they are not made available to the armies that need them, when the arteries are severed and the bloodstream ceases to flow, then must the war machine shrivel and die.
The United States submarines started at the very beginning to sink our ships, and the rate of losses constantly increased thereafter. Later, the air attacks, and particularly those of carrier task forces, added greatly to this loss. We were in a desperate position for shipping by middle of 1944, with nothing but disaster facing us. Our total shipping losses due to enemy action was about 8,800,000 tons. Of this amount, roughly 2/3 was sunk by United States submarines. The remainder was principally lost due to air attacks, including aerial mining, but with the naval air strikes having the highest total. The total personnel losses to our merchant marine during the war was between 100,000 and 120,000 men.
As you have heard from this presentation, a war machine cannot function when its army garrisons are bypassed, when its supplies are cut off, when its navy and its naval air arm are nullified, and its merchant shipping destroyed. These factors add up to a result that is as obvious as it is inevitable: total defeat.